This is finally the game that can reignite the New Orleans Saints and Atlanta Falcons rivalry.
You are Locked On NFL Crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's going on, everybody, and welcome into this crossover Thursday edition of Locked On Falcons and Locked On Saints. We are your hosts, Aaron Freeman over at Locked On Falcons, myself, Ross Jackson, with Locked On Saints. And on today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at this Week 10 just absolute banger of a matchup as the Atlanta Falcons travel to New Orleans to take on the New Orleans Saints. We're going to dive into how Atlanta is looking to counter the new coach bump for the New Orleans Saints. Take a look at the young players that have a lot to prove for both sides of this matchup. And we're going to lead everything off with the fact that this game is finally the game that we've been waiting for that could possibly reignite this rivalry. We appreciate you very much, as always, for being an everydayer and for making us your first listen here on the show, which is a proud part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's crossover Thursday is presented by Prize Picks. Download the app and use the promo code Locked On NFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Aaron, this matchup could finally be the one that gets us back to the glory days of the Saints and Falcons rivalry. You ready for it?
Yes and no. It's one of those things where, the hate weeks have not hit as hard in recent years as they used to. And so I want to get back to that. But at the same time, I kind of want, for selfish reasons, it to not maybe hit as hard, because maybe that means that the Falcons are taking care of business and it feels one-sided in our favor, which it was for so many years when Drew Brees was in New Orleans and Sean Payton was in New Orleans. And, it felt really big then because the Falcons were constantly losing. And I kind of want it to kind of die down a little bit so the Falcons can feel that sort of positive end on this rivalry. But we'll see how it breaks out.
Maybe it becomes a little bit more evenly competitive, right? Maybe it's a little bit more of that, or maybe the Falcons run with it for a couple of years and the Saints eventually start to narrow the gap themselves. But here's why I think this is the game, Aaron. Atlanta Falcons fans might remember fondly Arthur Smith getting fired at the end of last season. And one of the things that led up to that firing is something that New Orleans Saints fans will remember fondly, which is the last-second touchdown out of victory formation of Jamal Williams, his lone touchdown of the season, kind of leading to this spat between Arthur Smith as well as Dennis Allen, former New Orleans Saints head coach, who they have fired here earlier this week. And in that spat, you saw Dennis Allen kind of trying to de-escalate the situation, right? He put his hands on Arthur Smith's hips, which is a wild move in that situation, by the way, and tried to de-escalate the situation. But there's this guy back there in a gold cap that's just wants all the smoke, spouting, yelling, shouting over at Arthur Smith. He's actually the reason it felt like that Arthur Smith actually turned around and walked away, turned around, got one more glancing blow off, and then left. That guy is now the New Orleans Saints head coach. And that head coach is Darren Rizzi, who is the interim head coach, who is a part of that Parcells line, comes from the same lineage as Sean Payton in that Parcells line, and therefore has already promised that the team is going to be a lot more fun to watch under his watch. And so I think you're going to see a little bit more petty from this New Orleans Saints team than you have seen in recent years. And I think that ingredient is what's been missing in the rivalry gumbo, if you will, between the New Orleans Saints and the Atlanta Falcons. And I think Rizzi is going to bring that back.
You're right. And again, there was nothing better than seeing Sean Payton do all his shenanigans for the Falcons, like Deion Jones picking off passes and whatnot, making him eat his words. So, that is enough to get me maybe a little bit excited to see if Darren Rizzi can channel his inner Sean Payton and, to shut him up, nothing would feel better as a Falcon fan and for this Atlanta Falcon team.
Yeah, sure. And then on the other side of it is, the hope that Darren Rizzi reignites that long run of New Orleans Saints superiority over the Atlanta Falcons, which I'm going to just tell you, spoiler right now, I think he's going to do it. So we're going to be taking a look at all that. But obviously, the biggest story in this game for really both sides of this team, the New Orleans Saints dealing with a head coach that has been fired. The Atlanta Falcons now playing against a team that has a head coach that gets fired. When you look at it from your perspective, Aaron, are you looking at it as there's blood in the water because they fired their head coach, or is there like a concern because they fired their head coach that there might be kind of this new kind of rejuvenation of excitement amongst the team?
I lean towards the latter. It's more of a concern. I did a breakdown earlier this week on Locked On Falcons about the quote unquote interim coach bump and looked at it over the last decade, and teams have won more than they've lost with that first game. And the Falcons have been on the losing end of a couple of those games and have lost more games against interim head coaches, whether it's in that first game or their fourth or fifth game over that span, than they have won those games. And so, you know, as a Falcon fan who has a very long memory of all the dark times and bad times with this foot years, you know, that is front and center in my mind. And for all of the reasons that you're saying with Darren Rizzi, with that sort of, let's call it petty energy that he's going to bring and the fun energy that he's going to bring, like that is something that I don't want to see from the Saints team. I don't want to see team rejuvenated and getting back to looking like the team that they looked like at the very beginning of the season, where they were red hot offensively and their defense was playing really well. And if he can get that spark back into that building, you know, that's a very dangerous team. And that's a team that can definitely beat an Atlanta Falcons team that is ascending, but is by no means this juggernaut at this point in the season.
Yeah, and it feels like this is a team in the New Orleans Saints that, at least over on the offensive side, going up against an ascending Atlanta Falcons team, gets an opportunity to maybe have a little bit of a measuring stick here, right? Like, where are they now that they've made this change? Were all the issues really the head coach? Is a lot more of it the stuff that's happening on the field, the execution, all this other stuff kind of serves as a little bit of a barometer, if you will, for where the Saints are. I imagine there's something similar for the Atlanta Falcons here. As you mentioned, they are ascending. Now they get to go up against a common opponent that they barely beat, but did beat earlier this season. I imagine that there's a little bit of a measuring stick here for Atlanta's offense.
Yeah, they barely beat the Saints, mostly because the offense didn't really show up in that game. The defense did, the special teams did. And you've seen since that game, the Falcons offense has been a big part of that ascension. And so to me, this game is a big kind of litmus test to sort of see, okay, is that ascension going to continue against the Saints defense that you had so much trouble with early in the season? And you can show, okay, this is a clear-cut indicator, a litmus test, or that barometer that you're talking about of where this offense is at this point in the season compared to where they were at the end of September. And I think that's going to be a big proving ground for this team, because we know with this Atlanta Falcons team, their offense is humming at this point in time. They're 6-3. Their defense is okay, right? It's okay at best. But if this team is going to be a playoff team, if this team is going to do damage and be dangerous in the month of January, then it's going to be carried by Bijan Robinson and Kirk Cousins and that Falcons offense flying high. And so I think being able to basically correct the sins of that previous matchup and show, okay, we are for real. You know, we struggled in that week 4 matchup. We're not going to struggle in this week 10 matchup.
Yeah, and this is a game now for the New Orleans Saints on their offensive side of the football. Speaking of that litmus test, they're going to be able to kind of apply this litmus test to the youth and future of their roster. Guys like Chris Olave, who had 87 receiving yards, he's not going to play this week. He's got a second concussion in like 5 weeks. Very unlikely that he plays this week. Rashid, who had 83 receiving yards against Atlanta last time that these two teams met, he is done for the season after undergoing meniscus surgery. The one big key here is going to be Taysom Hill, who scored 2 touchdowns. We've talked a lot about Taysom Hill in this matchup, and we've made a lot of jokes about it. But in all seriousness, he's kind of, along with Alvin Kamara, the only real proven weapon that New Orleans has over on the offensive side of the football going into this game. So unless it's going to be those guys dominating this one, it's going to come down to some of the young talent or new faces on the offensive side of the football that New Orleans is going to be getting a look at getting started in this game if they're going to be able to win. And really, the young player thing kind of applies to both of these teams on the defensive side of the football as well. Let's take a look at that next, because both these teams have some big-time defensive names that are these younger guys that really, really need to be on top of their game in order for either of these teams to pull off a win. Let's get to that next. Here's we continue on with today's Locked On Falcons, Locked On Saints crossover Thursday, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Falcons and Locked On Saints is Crossover Thursday, brought to you by our friends over at ZBiotics, who have the pre-alcohol drink that you absolutely need to try out. every time that I have pre-alcohol drinks, I notice the next day that I am, after a night of being out and kind of having some fun and all of this stuff, I'm ready to go, whether it's recording a podcast, whether it's getting to work, all that other kind of stuff, no lingering effects, things like that. That's one of the reasons why I absolutely love it. Pre-alcohol probiotic drink by ZBiotics is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle those rough mornings after drinking. So here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a byproduct in your gut. It's that byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. So pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to help break down that byproduct just to make sure that you're good to go the next day. So just remember to take your to make your ZBiotics your first drink of the night, then drink responsibly, and then you'll be at your best tomorrow. So go check them out. Go to zbiotics.com/LockedOnNFL to learn more and get 15% off of your first order when you use the promo code LockedOnNFL at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money back guarantee. So if you're unsatisfied for any reason, you'll be able to get that back. They'll refund you your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/LockedOnNFL and use that promo code LockedOnNFL at checkout for 15% off. All right, everybody, continuing on with this crossover Thursday, Locked On Falcons, Locked On Saints. Aaron, as we take a look at the young players on the defensive side of the football, one guy that I'm sure a lot of Falcons fans are excited to see potentially return this week. A lot of Saints fans might not want to see return this week, could potentially be hitting the field for the Atlanta Falcons. What are you looking for over the defensive side of this matchup?
It is the hopefully triumphant return of Falcons linebacker Troy Anderson, who earned NFC Defensive Player of the Week honors after his performance in that earlier matchup this season, being a big part of the reason why the Falcons defense could keep a lid on the Saints offense. And you saw the pick six in that game. Yep. You saw him really sort of doing his best to kind of shadow Alvin Kamara, not shutting him down, but keeping him contained from really taking over the game. And the Falcons desperately need that. You talk about with this Saints offense, it basically, as you said, it's Alvin Kamara, it's Taysom Hill. And any Falcon fan that's seen this rivalry over the years knows that those guys can do a ton of damage and more than enough damage to win this game. And the Falcons, without Troy Anderson, just do not have the type of athletic linebacker that can hold his own against players of that skill set. And so the Falcons desperately need Troy Anderson back this week. Since that game, he suffered a knee injury late in that Week 4 win over the Saints and hasn't played since. The Falcons have kind of slow played his return. He's been practicing the last couple of weeks. The expectation is that he'll fully participate this week. Wednesday's practice was more of a walkthrough, so the Falcons won't really know what everybody's official status is until much later in the week. But all signs, all indications are that Troy Anderson is coming back this week. And the Falcons desperately need him just specifically for these matchups and to provide another boost to the middle of that defense where you've seen former Saints linebacker Caden Ellis. He's been a big part of, I won't say a resurrection because the Falcons pass rush is still bottom of the league, but it's an improving pass rush. Maybe we'll get from 32 to 31. We got 3 sacks last week, in part a big part of that due to Caden Ellis, and to unleash Caden Ellis's ability fully as a pass rusher to aid this anemic pass rush, you need to have that other linebacker being able to do all the coverage things that Caden Ellis isn't necessarily being asked to do. And so that combination of Caden Ellis pass rushing the quarterback, Troy Anderson in coverage is the sort of combination that we've been looking so forward to for this Falcons defense over the last couple of years. But because of injuries to Troy Anderson, we just really haven't seen it, and hopefully we'll get to see it on Sunday.
Yeah, a couple of key pieces to that. Alvin Kamara, of course, the New Orleans Saints running back, coming off a 215 total yards game last week up against the Carolina Panthers in their loss in Carolina. And then when it comes to the offensive line, Lucas Patrick, the Saints' interior offensive line, injured again. I've been told per sources that he's in a boot right now. So that just gives you more kind of concern when it comes to the New Orleans Saints pass rush protection. I know you're probably not going to see Caden Ellis rush too much up the middle, but I mean, if you're able to apply pressure there, he certainly can do that and provide that pressure up the A gap. And then of course, if you're able to generate pressure with him on the outside, that weakens that interior, opening up some opportunities for some other players to maybe get some pressure. So definitely a couple of things to watch there with those linebackers being back and available in Troy Anderson. And then of course, Caden Ellis, who is already available, but Saints fans very familiar with what he can do as a pass rusher, of course. Over on the Saints side of things, when it comes to defense, I think it's a lot about the young players there too, but it's several, right? Like this is the Saints fired their head coach. So the rest of the season for 8 games is about getting an evaluation of the young players that you have, who can be cornerstones, who can be building blocks for your future iteration. The Saints have embraced their rebuild. Not only did they fire their head coach, Aaron, they traded Marshon Lattimore away. They sent him back into the Commanders. Got a pretty good return back in the process, but none of that return is going to impact what they have on the field this weekend. However, as interim head coach Darren Rizzi did say on Wednesday, when I asked him about Alontae Taylor, the cornerback that's likely to be the top corner on the outside, typically the slot corner for the New Orleans Saints defense, as Rizzi did say, they're used to playing without Marshon Lattimore. That's out of the ordinary for them. They've missed several games over the course of the past couple of seasons, all that kind of stuff. So they've done this before. So for me, it's about getting a look at guys like Alontae Taylor. There's a 2nd round pick in Kool-Aid McKinstry out of Alabama. I don't know if he's going to make it back in time. He missed last week's game with a hamstring injury. He missed Wednesday's practice with a hamstring injury. We'll see where things go today and tomorrow. But a guy like Shamar Jean-Charles, who had one of the best interceptions that we've seen in a long time in New Orleans up against Carolina last week, and ripping a ball right out of wide receiver Xavier Legette's hands of the Carolina Panthers. And it's going to be the other kind of young players that are going to be able to make plays there. They get an opportunity here to begin their evaluation process, and they get to get an evaluation process on this defense going up against an ascending offense in the Atlanta Falcons. Here's the thing that's going to be the biggest concern. Along with firing your head coach, if you're the New Orleans Saints, in Dennis Allen, you've also fired your defensive play caller and your defensive coordinator for that matter. By title, Joe Woods, the defensive coordinator, now gets added to as a defensive play caller. And then they're kind of splitting up the responsibilities when it comes to how they're game planning. So 2 coaches will handle the run game plan. 2 coaches, which include Joe Woods, will handle the passing game plan, defensive game plan. And then Joe Woods will call the defensive plays. I don't know how I feel about that, if I'm being completely honest.
Okay. Yeah,
it feels like too many cooks in the kitchen, right?
Yeah, and you know better than me. I don't recall Joe Woods' tenure in Cleveland as the defensive coordinator as a particularly successful one. Is that an accurate statement?
That's a fair thing to say, and I think many would say that his resume as a play caller is shaky at best as well. And so I think both of those things generate a little bit of, I don't want to say concern, but I will certainly say it generates question marks in terms of their ability to be successful in this situation.
Yeah. Now, Rosh, you're talking about the Saints embracing the rebuild, and I just want to quickly ask you because this has been something that I, in my existential nightmares about worrying about the future of this rivalry. Sure. My concern is that the Saints embrace this rivalry too well, and they go through whatever they got to do, evaluate the young players on their talent this year, and then next year they bring in a new head coach. And they basically do the thing that everybody's been screaming at them to do for years and years, which is like, hey, you got to tear it down. You got to trade off all these veteran players. Just go young, start Spencer Rattler, see what he has for a year, and probably not get positive results. And the Saints are picking high enough in the 2026 draft where they may be in a position to take a young, phenomenal quarterback that has a legacy in New Orleans because his grandfather played for that team. And so this is my nightmare, Ross. And so I'm worried, like how much is there a chance? Please allay my fears by telling me that that's not going to happen. The Saints and Kai Hartley, Mickey Loomis, they're all going to just stick with what they're going to do and what they've always done. And that future is not going to become a reality.
I think it might even be worse than that, in that the Saints kind of can't trade those veteran players away, because they've been restructured to hell and all these other things. And so they're going to either have to hope that those veteran players retire, or they're going to have to roll into next season with, again, the oldest roster in the NFL, which is probably still going to put them in position for that very pick that you're concerned about in 2026. So I do think that there is a version of this that doesn't actually require them to tear everything down to the studs here in 2025. And still end up in a situation where the rebuild becomes very successful because of the rookie quarterback that they land in 2026. I expect that Derek Carr will still be the quarterback in 2025 because you can't really move on from him. The only way you're going to move on from him, because if you cut him, you're not in a good situation there because you need to restructure his contract or ship away his contract in order to get under the salary cap over the course of the offseason. So unless you're going to get him to agree to a no trade clause and ship him somewhere where he doesn't have to agree to a rebuild, the only way to do it is to restructure him and then keep him around. Then you get a new head coach. Then you have a bunch of aging veterans that are still aging veterans unless they retire. And then you're kind of in the same boat by the end of next year as you were set to be at the end of this year. And you have a high draft pick. So I think it's a combination of the two things. It's a combination of the two things in terms of, yeah, they kind of can't tear it all down to the studs. But not tearing it down to the studs may end up putting them in play for exactly what it is that you're afraid of. And that will be the version of them embracing their rebuild, is delaying stuff for one more year and then being able to flip things over a little bit more quickly than they'd be able to in 2025.
Okay. So I obviously we don't know what the future holds, right. But in the meantime, I just hope the Falcons just beat the brakes off of the Saints so that I can get some joy before my nightmare comes true in 2026 and beyond. So hopefully this week and then 2025, Falcons 3-0, hate week. Let's keep it going.
Prepare to get rizzed, my friend, because that's exactly what's going to happen this weekend. Coming up next, we're going to take a look. We're going to take a look at how the Atlanta Falcons could avoid getting rizzed with that interim coach bump that they have not had much luck in their history avoiding. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with this crossover Thursday edition of Locked On Falcons and Locked On Saints. Part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This crossover Thursday edition of Locked On Falcons and Locked On Saints brought to you by friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, where you can get ready to continue to tackle the NFL season. Because right now, new customers can put $5 down and then walk away with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. Right now, the New Orleans Saints are underdogs at home. The Falcons favored on the road. 3.5 points is the spread. Maybe you like the Falcons to cover that. Maybe you like the Saints to kind of beat the spread, but maybe not necessarily get the upset. You can get into all that over at FanDuel Sportsbook on their app, where you can check out everything from live betting to latest stats to play-by-plays, all in the same place where you're placing all of your bets. So just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com, where you can make every moment more with one of the sportsbook partners of the NFL. Today's episode also brought to you by friends over at PrizePicks. As all of our crossover Thursday episodes are, PrizePicks is the easiest and most fun way to play daily fantasy sports. It's just you versus the house, not a bunch of mystery lineups and all that other stuff. It's you and your football knowledge, basketball knowledge, baseball knowledge. They have everything that you could ever imagine versus PrizePicks and their projections. Here's how it works. You pick 2 to 6 players. PrizePicks will give you projections on those players. So they might say Bijan Robinson, 79.5 rushing yards, for instance. They might say Drake London, 59.5 receiving yards. All you have to do is choose more or less than those projections. If you get 4 of those right, you're going up to 100 times your entry back. It's that easy over at PrizePicks. It's awesome. It's my favorite way to play daily fantasy sports. So go and check them out today. You can download the PrizePicks app and then use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. Once again, download the app today. Use that promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. All right, everybody, crossover Thursday here, Locked On Falcons and Locked On Saints, breaking down this New Orleans Saints hosting the Atlanta Falcons matchup. We're going to take a look at the things that the Atlanta Falcons and New Orleans Saints need to do to get a win, while the Falcons look to kind of push away that first or that interim coach bump. As always, crossover Thursday brought to you by our friends over at PrizePicks, where you can use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL in all lowercase and get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. Aaron, what is it that the Atlanta Falcons need to do to avoid that interim coach bump that you have dug into and found that the Atlanta Falcons have not done so great, have not fared so great against in the past?
Well, I think the first thing the Falcons need to do is they need to stop the Saints on early downs. I think the second thing is get off to a fast start offensively. And then the third thing is not fall into the trap that comes with facing an interim head coach. And going back to that first thing, normally I would say you got to stop the run. But and that's a big part of the Saints' early down success. In their first 2 games of the season, I looked it up. They were number 1 in the NFL in expected points added per play on early downs, first and second down. Since then, the Saints are number 31st. So they won the first 2 games. They were number 1. They've lost the last 7 games when they've been second to last. And so it's essentially, if you can stop the Saints on early downs, you can stop the Saints. And so again, stopping the run is a big part of that. And that's where you got to slow down Taysom Hill. You got to slow down Alvin Kamara. You got to have Troy Anderson in this lineup to help do that. And then getting to the second thing, which is going to help with that first thing, it's just getting off to a fast start offensively, right? The best run defense for the Falcons, who have not had a particularly good run defense this year, has been their offense. And you saw that the last couple of weeks when they've been able to get leads, and that forces opposing teams, that happened in the Tampa Bay game, happened in the Dallas game, to basically abandon the run at a certain point because they're playing catch up. And you saw this last week with the Falcons having 3 sacks, again, almost matching their season total of previously 6 sacks in their first 8 games of the season. And a lot of that was owed to the fact that they got an early lead, and their pass rushers were able to pin their ears back. They were able to run a lot of twists and stunts and games and all that various things and get after Dak Prescott and eventually Cooper Rush in that game. So if the offense can score points early, that's going to be not only a boost for the Falcons run defense, but also the Falcons pass rush. And then the third thing, don't fall into the trap. Now, Raheem Morris said there's no such thing as a trap game in the NFL earlier this week, because basically you have to be prepared each and every week. And he's right in that sense. But when I refer to the trap, I'm referring to the fact that the Saints have a new coaching staff, and that new coaching staff with Darren Rizzi getting rizzed up,
rizzed up, baby,
is going to, I have to say it because I've been pushing Kirk Vimber and Kirk Tober on everybody else. So, if you want to come up with your own hashtags or slogans, Ross, I will support you in that.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
But, basically with the new coaching staff, there's going to be new energy in the building. And this is a golden opportunity, as we've been discussing, that they can throw some new wrinkles into things. Like, you can't just go into this game expecting, okay, we know what a Dennis Allen defense is. We've seen it for the last 7 years. We've seen, what a Clint Kubiak offense is, but now you have a different guy that can basically go to Clint Kubiak and say, okay, let's switch some things up, and you can catch the Falcons sleeping and thus have that sort of trap game.
Yeah. Have you ever seen Waterboy?
I have.
The commentators in the Bourbon Bowl where they're like, last game of the year, can't hold anything back now. Yeah. That's how I feel about the New Orleans Saints going into this game. They're that, right? It's the last game of the year. Can't hold anything back now. Might as well just throw it all out there and see what you got, right?
Yeah,
so
definitely.
I get the concern there in terms of where that comes from. I will say that when it comes to like limiting the early downs, that is key for dismantling the New Orleans Saints attack and Clint Kubiak's attack. If this team gets behind the sticks, they struggle. Plain and simple, right? They just struggle. I think the Los Angeles Chargers are the great blueprint for that. I think the Saints were like 13% on third down because so many of their third downs were 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9, 3rd and 15, 3rd and 16, 3rd and 20, like all these other situations. And some of that was the Saints shooting themselves in the foot with penalties and stuff like that. They're fine in terms of the amount of penalties that they have. The issue is when the penalties take place and how the penalties end up killing their drives. So yeah, I think that's an astute observation. And then coupling that with fast starts obviously complicates things for New Orleans as well. For the Saints, I think the things that they need to do really come down to what they're doing to themselves in terms of avoiding like the self-inflicted wounds and things like that. So I do think that it's important for them to play fast and play free. And what I mean by that is not hamper themselves, not hold themselves back in this situation. They also need to be able to run, and preferably do so with Taysom Hill, who had 2 touchdowns. He's kind of got to finish what he started in Atlanta. He's got to finish that job here in New Orleans. He had 2 touchdowns against Atlanta earlier this season. And then I think a big one is just showing up in the fourth quarter. The Saints have been in a lot of situations where they have had their defense on the field with a lead and have not been able to win that game. And the Saints need to get past that. And so I don't know if the Riz helps them do that, right? Gives them a little bit of that extra motivation, if you will, but they've got to get games closed out. when they have the opportunity to do so. But I honestly think the most important one out of those three, Aaron, comes down to Taysom Hill, because the Saints are simply going to need a counterpunch to who has been their most productive player, which has been Alvin Kamara. And Taysom is the most likely one to do it. He's the only non-new face that's involved in the consistent part of their passing attack. I think getting their tight ends involved would go a long way too, but that has been a struggle for this team on a consistent basis. So I think those are three things they got to do. I would love to see them play fast, play free, have fun again, especially in a rivalry game like this. But really, it's all going to come down to their ability to be able to close it out if they get into a situation where they're in a good scenario by the time that the fourth quarter rolls around.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when you play the Falcons, there's a good chance you'll be in a good situation going into the fourth quarter, because pretty much all their games are one possession games.
And any situation in the fourth quarter is a good situation against the Falcons, right? Isn't that what we've learned?
Something like that, bro. They've been better this year, thanks to
that's true. That is true.
We're leaving the past behind. That's basically what
we'll see about that. Listen, I think the Saints, I think they kick this one off. And even if they don't win, they're massively competitive in this game in a way that nobody expects them to be. And then they probably come crashing down to earth after that. But I just think the emotional charge of this game with the new interim head coach, and the rivalry of it all is going to be enough to kind of give this team a jolt. My biggest concern is their wide receivers. Who are they throwing the football to and everything like that. And so unless Marquez Valdez-Scantling's about to go off, and Mason Tipton, their rookie wide receiver, undrafted guy, goes off and stuff like that, they don't have like familiar guys they can go to. So I think that's where it gets in trouble. But I think New Orleans is going to come in with a lot of charge, a lot of motivation, a lot of determination in this game, and at least keep it interesting.
Yeah, I think that's true. So I think, that's what gives me hope in the fourth quarter, is that if the Saints have to go down the field and put points,
sure.
Not having Chris Olave, not having Rashid Shaheed, we'll see if the Falcons can keep Juwan Johnson and Foster Moreau in check and whatnot. But I think that's the one thing that gives me some hope, that if it does come down to a one possession game and the Falcons need to go down the field and score, they should be able to do it. And hopefully this Falcons defense will be able to prevent this version of the Saints offense from doing it in the closing minutes.
See how it goes. It's going to be a lot of fun. We appreciate you very much for being here with us for another Crossover Thursday. Make sure you come back on Friday, as Aaron and I on our individual shows will be breaking down this matchup a little bit further, looking ahead, things like that. The Falcons injury report was estimated on Wednesday, so there'll be more information there coming out later on today. The Saints, will see how their injury report continues to roll along, all these other things as well. So keep it locked over on Locked On Falcons and on Locked On Saints so make sure you have the latest for this upcoming matchup. For Aaron Freeman, I am Ross Jackson, and we will see you again here very soon on Locked On Falcons and Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.